Imagine this for a moment. You're 26, just 3 days ago. Your husband died trying to protect your city from a brutal Spartan attack. Now, you're standing in the ruins of what used to be your home, clutching your 3 terrified children, praying the soldiers passing by won't notice you. But they do. A Spartan officer stops in front of you. He doesn't ask if you're all right. He wants your age. He points to your children, asks if they're yours. You answer, barely able to speak. He writes something on his wax board, then walks away. You don't know what he wrote, but you feel it's something bad. That night, soldiers storm back in. They grab your children. You scream, but it doesn't matter. Your 3-year-old cries for you, tries to follow as you're dragged away with hundreds of other women. You look back. Their faces blur with tears. You don't know if you'll ever see them again. But this is just the beginning. And what comes next? It's so horrifying. Even ancient writers said it would have been kinder if these women had simply died. What Sparta did wasn't random cruelty, it was a carefully planned system. And it's time the truth came out. To understand what happened to those women, you need to understand what Sparta really was. Most people imagine ancient Greece as a place of philosophers, art, and democracy. And yes, Athens liked to call itself the center of wisdom and freedom, but it hid its own dark side well. Sparta didn't bother pretending. It was brutally honest. It was a military machine built to fight, conquer, and dominate. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and trained in a system called the agage. They were taught to survive pain, follow orders without question, and kill without hesitation. Weak babies were left to die. Individual dreams, emotions, or identity, none of that mattered. You weren't raised to be a person. You were raised to be a weapon. But behind that military strength was a hidden true fear. Sparta was a small elite group ruling over a massive population of slaves called helots. For every Spartan, there were at least 10 helots. These enslaved people worked the farms, did the hard labor, and kept the economy running. Spartans lived in constant fear that these helots would rise up. One rebellion could wipe them out, and this fear shaped everything Sparta did, especially how it treated conquered people, especially their women. Killing warriors wasn't enough. They wanted to crush a society from the inside out. Sparta understood something deeply cruel. If you wanted to erase an enemy forever, you didn't just kill their soldiers. You broke their women. You controlled their ability to have children. You made sure the next generation belonged to you, not to their people. That was the real victory. So when Spartan armies took over a city, what happened after the battle was even darker than the fight itself. The men of fighting age were usually already dead or lined up for execution. The elderly and young boys were taken away. But the women, especially women aged between 15 and 40, were handled differently. Spartan officers moved through the captured crowd, inspecting women the same way they'd inspect soldiers. They looked at age, health, social status, even family background. Were you a warrior's wife? A leader's daughter? A priestess? Every detail mattered. This wasn't chaos. It was planned. Women were sorted like inventory. Some were sent to the fields, forced to work as slaves. Others were taken into homes. But for young, Healthy women from noble families, a different fate awaited. Sparta didn't just want to use them. They wanted to use their bodies as tools to erase an entire culture. And for those women, survival came with a price far worse than death. Imagine this. Your husband had been a leader in your city, someone respected, maybe even feared. He died fighting Spartans just weeks ago. Now you're standing in a cold hall, dressed in ceremonial clothing not to mourn him, but to be married to a Spartan citizen, one of the very men who destroyed your life. Everyone is watching. They know exactly what this is. It isn't love. It isn't choice. It's domination dressed up as marriage. You speak the ritual words, pretending to be a bride. But inside, you're breaking. After the ceremony, you're taken to his home, where you're expected to act like a Spartan wife. Cook, clean, manage the house. But the biggest expectation? You're supposed to have children who will be raised as Spartans, trained to fight for the very people who slaughtered your family. Those children will carry Spartan names. They'll be citizens, but part of you will never be forgotten. Some will grow up not knowing where their mothers came from. Others will know but be too afraid to speak of it. Their very existence will be proof that Sparta could crush not just armies but legacies, bloodlines, and entire cultures. And for the women, pretending to be part of this new life was its own kind of death. To outsiders, it looked like these women had survived. They weren't executed. They weren't thrown into prison. But what they were forced to do was something ancient writers described as worse than death. Because surviving wasn't just about breathing, it was about participating. You had to smile, pretend, raise your children to love the people who had taken everything from you. You were expected to play your role perfectly. Be a good wife, a good mother, raise strong Spartan boys who might someday march back into your homeland and slaughter the last of your people. You had to cook for your captor, sleep beside him, teach his children to be proud Spartans, all while you mourned the family he helped destroy. Some women broke under the weight of it. Others found small ways to resist whispers of their language. Stories told in secret to their children. Silent looks passed between women who remembered freedom. There are ancient accounts of noble women who refused to fully take part, even when it meant punishment. Some never smiled again. Some taught their children rebellion in the form of quiet disobedience. And some couldn't take the pain at all. There are stories of women who threw themselves off cliffs rather than be forced into marriage with the enemy. Ancient writers tried to frame those suicides as acts of virtue honor through death. But let's be honest, the fact that death felt like the only way out tells us everything we need to know about how cruel this system really was. And it got even darker, because not all women were married into Spartan society. Some were used in even more horrific ways. Sparta believed in controlling not just its own bloodline, but that of the people it conquered. Strong warriors didn't come from nowhere, they were made. So Sparta extended its obsession with strength and breeding into the lives of its captives. Some women were chosen not for marriage but for reproduction. Not wives, breeders. They were selected based on their physical traits, height, strength, looks. Not to raise families, but to produce offspring. Some were paired with Spartan men to create children who might become loyal to Sparta. Others were forced to reproduce with helots, creating slaves who would be strong enough for harder labor. These weren't partnerships. They weren't relationships. They were assignments. The women had no say, no rights, no protection. Their value was judged only by what kind of child they might produce. And what about those children? Some would be raised as half-citizens. Others would be born into slavery. But all of them carried a shadow the knowledge that they were born from violence, from captivity, from a system that saw their mothers as property. For the women, it was unbearable, because despite everything, they were still mothers. They loved their children. How do you love a child who reminds you of what was done to you? How do you raise them in a world built on the ruins of your old one? These weren't accidents. This wasn't war chaos. It was a policy planned and practiced. It was a part of Spartan dominance just as much as their spears and shields. They didn't just conquer cities. They conquered the future. Most of the captured women weren't even given the twisted honor of forced marriage or assigned breeding. Their fate was even more crushing. They became helots' state-owned slaves who kept Sparta running while the warriors focused on battle. These women were tossed into a system built entirely on labor, pain, and obedience. And once you entered it, you never left. You didn't just lose your home, you lost your name, your place in the world, your future. Life as a helot woman meant endless, backbreaking work. In the fields, under the sun, planting and harvesting food you'd never get to eat. In workshops, producing goods for people who saw you as less than human. In households, serving Spartan families. Raising their children while your own were pulled away from you. There was no freedom, no hope, no protection. If they forced themselves on them, there were no consequences. The women were property. They couldn't say no, couldn't fight back. Children born from these assaults became helots to adding to the growing population of slaves. For many helot women, it wasn't just their bodies that were taken. It was their motherhood, their right to raise their children with love and dignity. Some spent their entire lives in Spartan homes cooking, cleaning, and feeding the very people who had shattered their past. They watched Spartan children grow strong and proud while their own were taught nothing but silence and fear. Their children couldn't run, couldn't dream, couldn't even speak their own names with pride. They were born into chains, and they would die wearing them. The emotional pain was relentless. These women remembered who they had been before. They weren't always slaves. Many had once been daughters of nobles, wives of warriors, priestesses in temples. Now they were forced to scrub floors, harvest crops, and obey every order like they were nothing. And worse, they had to watch their children grow up inside this nightmare, never knowing what it meant to be free. They lived in small slave communities, sometimes surrounded by others who had shared their fate. But even there, danger was never far, because in Sparta, even being a helot wasn't safe. If you were too strong, too smart, or too proud, you became a target. And that's where the darkest part begins. There was something in Sparta called the cryptia. To outsiders, it might have sounded like a strange ritual. But for the Helots, especially women, it was pure terror. This was a brutal tradition where teenage Spartan boys were sent into the countryside with a simple mission: hunt and kill any Helot who looked too confident, too strong, or too brave. These weren't criminals. They weren't armed. They were just people often caught doing something as simple as speaking up, standing tall, or working too hard. That alone could mark them for death. Young Spartans would stalk them like animals. No warning, no trial, just a quick, silent kill. This was part of their training to teach them how to kill without hesitation, without guilt. For the Helots, it was a nightmare that never ended. At any time, they could be murdered for no reason at all. And yes, women were targeted to if a Helot woman was seen encouraging her children too much. If she taught them about their past, if she simply carried herself with pride, she could be mocked. The Spartans didn't need a reason. They just needed to believe she might one day inspire rebellion. And so, many women lived their entire lives in fear. They taught their children to be invisible, not too fast, not too smart, not too curious. Because in Sparta, showing spirit was the same as signing your own death sentence. Can you imagine that? Waking up every day not just as a slave, but as prey. Knowing your life had no value. That a teenage boy could take it away just to prove himself as a warrior. But Sparta didn't stop there. They used their victories to send messages loud, public, humiliating messages. When they conquered a city, they didn't just take over land and kill soldiers. They celebrated by turning the women into trophies. Captive women were paraded through Spartan streets, especially those from powerful families, wives of rulers, daughters of priests. They were stripped of their fine clothing, forced to wear rags, and marched like animals while the citizens watched and laughed. And the worst part? Other women joined in. Spartan women, proud of their sons and husbands, stood by jeering, mocking, and insulting the captives. There was no sympathy, no shared sisterhood, just cruelty. These rituals weren't just for fun, they were part of Sparta's system of control. A warning to every other city: resist us, and this is what we'll do to your women. It was psychological warfare at its most vicious, and the pain didn't end with the parade. These humiliations weren't random acts. They were part of a planner system meant to break spirits and send a message across Greece. And it worked. The fear of becoming a slave, of having your wife or daughter paraded in chains, silenced many cities. Sparta built a reputation that reached far beyond its borders. But behind that power, there were real names, real faces, and real pain. Whole cities were wiped out, not by fire, but by silence. One of the worst examples was Messenia, conquered in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. An entire Greek population enslaved. Messenian women were forced into Helot status, their children born as slaves. And yet, they remembered. For generations, they secretly passed on stories, songs, names of lost leaders. But even that small act was dangerous. Sharing your past meant showing pride, and pride could get you killed by the Cryptia. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta continued this practice. After the Battle of Mantinea, children were pulled from screaming mothers. Families torn apart. Some women disappeared into slavery. Others were handed over as political pawns used for months or years to pressure their families into surrender. And when Sparta finally began to lose its power, their enemies returned the cruelty. At Leuctra, Thebes crushed Sparta. They captured Spartan women and treated them with the same brutality Sparta had used for generations. It was called justice, a reversal of fate. Sparta always claimed their violence was sacred, that the gods had chosen them to rule. Religion was their excuse. They believed forcing a woman into marriage or using her for breeding was not a sin. It was their divine right. But in the end, that belief became their weakness. The Helot system required constant control. Spartans couldn't leave for long wars without risking rebellion at home. Their citizen population shrank over time, and their strict laws prevented outsiders from joining. By the time Messenia gained freedom in 369 BCE, it shattered Sparta's foundation. Without enslaved labor, their economy collapsed. Their warrior class couldn't survive, and no one came to help them. Why would they? Every neighbor remembered what Sparta had done. The women they enslaved, the children they stole, the humiliation they forced on entire cultures. When Sparta needed allies, all it found was silence. Because pain, when passed from mother to daughter, doesn't fade. It waits. Ancient writers said these women suffered fates worse than death. And now, you understand why. Death would have ended the pain, but these women lived on, forced to raise their captors' children, to smile while dying inside, to serve the same people who had destroyed everything they loved. They were turned into tools of conquest, their very existence shaped by the needs of a cruel empire. Most of their names are gone, their stories lost. But they were real. They lived, they suffered, and their pain shaped history more than any general ever did. If this truth moved you, if you believe these women should be remembered, then tell their story. Share it. Speak their names when you can. Because history wasn't written by the conquerors alone. It was carried by the women who were never allowed to speak.